Hi, it's Tom Slater. And before we get into this week's Spiked podcast, I want to tell you about Last Orders. It's Spiked's monthly nanny state podcast where myself and Chris Snowden talk about the latest in public health killjoyism with the help of an invited guest. We've just relaunched the show in a brand new feed, and in the latest episode, we're joined by the comedian and Radio 4 star Simon Evans. We talk, among other things, about woke coke users, the relative merits of booze and ketamine, and why the Scots are so angry at Jamie Oliver. To listen to that and to make sure you never miss an episode, just search for Last Orders wherever you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Now, on with the Spike podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and joining me today are Spike's deputy editor and host of the Last Orders podcast, Tom Slater.
Hello, hello.
And Spiked columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
On this week's podcast, we discuss grooming gangs, I speak to free speech campaigner Jacob Mchangama, and finally, we talk about the ban on swearing at Britain's biggest urban music festival.
15 girls, the oldest of whom was 17 and the youngest just 11, were abused by the gang of 20 men over a period of several years.
Young, vulnerable white girls.
The men, mostly of Pakistani heritage, were convicted of more than 120 offences.
Rotherham, Oxford, Rochdale, Derby, Banbury, Telford, Peterborough, Aylesbury, Bristol, Halifax, Keighley, Newcastle, Huddersfield. This is a familiar scandal.
20 members of a grooming gang have been convicted of trafficking, drugging and raping 15 girls in Huddersfield, West Yorkshire. It follows a number of similar cases of mostly Asian grooming gangs targeting vulnerable white girls. So, Tom, is this a problem that we are unwilling to confront as a society? Because it keeps on happening.
Completely. I think it's definitely the case that we have been for a very long time unwilling to talk about this because, as you mentioned, Fraser, this is not an isolated case. We all know that. This comes after Rotherham, after Oxford, after Rochdale, Derby, Telford, Newcastle, and now Huddersfield, in which you have what can really be described as kind of industrial scale, in some cases, pimping and raping of often young, white, working-class girls by, largely speaking, British Pakistani men. And for a very long time, this was not only just not talked about, it was actively hushed over and not investigated. That was one of the things that came out of the horrendous Rotherham scandal, was that effectively the police admitted to the fact that they shied away from investigating these cases. The people involved didn't see justice for many, many years because of the terror of being accused of racism, given the fact that the profile of these men fit a certain type, shall we say. And even in terms of the media, you think Andrew Norfolk, of course, of the Times, famously broke this story of Rotherham in 2011. But again, he himself has admitted that cases like this and tips like this were piling up on his desk for many years before he wanted to do something about it. And the reason for that is, for a very long time, the question of Asian grooming gangs, Muslim grooming gangs, I'm sure we'll get into the kind of debate about the language, was largely something that the only people who talked about it were Nick Griffin of the British National Party, racist fascist party, and later on Tommy Robinson, the English Defence League. You have various kind of different kind of online agitators talking about it now, but for a long time it was just that was the only people who were talking about it. It was thought of as a kind of far-right scare story. What these horrible cases constantly remind us is when you shy away from having difficult discussions, which can sometimes mean touching on very, very touchy topics like this, then you allow them to be exploited by people who do want to, demonise certain groups in society. I think all this talk about it being a far-right trope, I think, just speaks to the fact that we allowed it to become one by not talking about it in a proper, careful, but direct fashion all these years.
And I suppose it's one of those cases where you really can't ignore the ethnicity of the perpetrators. Research by the Quilliam Foundation said that 84% of those convicted of child grooming gang offences between 2005 and 2017 were South Asian. The majority of those, in their words, were of Pakistani origin with Muslim heritage. The National Crime Agency says around 80% also. And, while there are more white paedophiles in Britain, they tend to act alone, whereas the grooming gang phenomenon seems to be largely a British Asian phenomenon. What do we make of that and the unwillingness to even say the truth of that?
Well, I think the truth is important because this is such a specific thing. As you say, it's not just about paedophilia, it's about grooming gangs, so it's a different kind of thing you're dealing with. And the unwillingness to be direct and truthful about this has led to a real mess. So you had last week Sajid Javid getting into trouble for saying on Twitter, "These sick Asian paedophiles are finally facing justice. I want to commend the bravery of the victims. For too long they were ignored and not on my watch." And he was lambasted as being racist and
Uncle Tom, all that kind of
yeah,
stuff.
really ugly backlash to him. But as it happens, he too wasn't being exactly specific. I don't think he was being racist, but he was also sort of avoiding the point. There was a really fabulous article on Spiked by Hardeep Singh, in which I just read the quote from it because it's so good. He says, "In insisting on referring to grooming gangs as Asian, journalists are lending the perpetrators a cloak of anonymity." And I think this is really what has been going on, right from what Sarah Champion, the MP, was talking about in relation to Rotherham, now to the unwillingness to sort of report accurately on Huddersfield. Because there's such a sensitivity specifically around the fact of these perpetrators being Muslim and about large numbers of them being British Pakistani men, and whatever significance that might bring, you're just sort of making wild generalizations, not getting to the heart of what's actually going on, and crucially not giving the victims justice, because the victims themselves have said that it was significant that these guys were from the backgrounds that they were from, and it was significant that they were white working class girls. So if you want to continue to allow this to just go on as if it was nothing serious, or not pay it that much attention, then let's keep talking about it in general terms. But you've got to face the music at some point and say, perhaps we need to have a conversation about why specifically it is these gangs of guys that are doing these things.
So there seems to be a lot of silence around this issue, partly because these are the wrong kinds of perpetrators. But also there is a sense perhaps that these are the wrong kinds of victims too. These are white working class girls. They're not the kind of upper middle class celebrities or journalists that we're so used to reading about, having experiences of knee touching and come-ons in Parliament or anything like that.
No, I know Ella's written far more about this than I have, but it is striking when you think about how much of the past year we've spent talking about a journalist having her knee touched by a member of Parliament, that we've talked about other journalists kind of having a sort of run-in with an MP who tried to kiss them, etc. And that dominating the news for days and days and days, and most of us looking at it and thinking, probably wasn't that bad, or it certainly wasn't bad enough to, generate this kind of level of media discussion. And yet, in this situation, because these people are kind of the wrong kind of victims, because they are young working class girls who don't have Twitter accounts, who don't have huge public profiles, who aren't the kind of people who have instant access to the media and aren't the people who kind of set the narrative, because of it's inconvenient that they're there, partly because of who they are and also partly because of, as you say, who these perpetrators are. And just to touch on what Ella was talking about quickly, about the kind of, in a way, and Hardeep makes that point in that article very well, which is the fact that if anything, there is a problem with calling them Asian insofar as it's not necessarily all Asians running around doing this. It's not Indian Hindu people running around doing this in the main. And it's not also kind of Pakistani Christians doing this, specifically it's Pakistani Muslims. And it's important to talk about that, firstly, because of the fact that in many cases, this is an aggravating factor in these crimes. This came out in the Rotherham trial in particular, where specifically, according to these men's warped, horrible worldview, whilst, Muslim women are there to be repressed, non-Muslim white women are fair game, effectively, and they are, some of the quotes coming out of them being referred to as white slags and all this kind of stuff, really, really grim stuff. So it's important to talk about it there. But it's also fascinating how even up to now with the Sajid Javid stuff, suddenly that discussion about the word Asian has kind of become more into the front. But for a very long time, a lot of people felt oddly comfortable about talking about Asian, effectively smearing vast numbers of people, rather than talking about this being specifically a Pakistani Muslim thing. It was almost like they would rather throw huge swathes of people under the bus than speak about this specifically. In the end, it felt like to try and protect Islam from criticism, because it's seen as something which is so dangerous to do nowadays. And I think that's one of this is complicated, and there's a lot of kind of conflicting anxieties and concerns when discussing this. But I think it is kind of significant that almost in the pursuit of trying to kind of hush this over in the name of anti-racism, they ended up being kind of more racist in a weird sort of way in terms of how they ended up discussing this stuff.
You end up allowing people like Tommy Robinson to smear all Muslims, all Asians, all Pakistani men as potential paedophiles, as horrible people, and by not being accurate about the kind of the specifics of this case. I also just want to add on top of it that there's part of me that is really reacting to not the panic about it, because these are specific cases that are coming out, and you read a list of all the different areas of the UK that are affected, and there are more. I read this big long list on the BBC and thought, you do think, Christ, I mean, this is a really big problem. On the other hand, I know that Spiked and I have written for a long time about the paedophile panic, and what we don't want to do is feed this idea that because of some cases, and they are just some cases, this is not a widespread epidemic, that we should then feed this decades-long fear of intergenerational relationships. This shouldn't be allowed to go into the hands of people like Tommy Robinson, who say, don't let your kids near a Muslim guy. All of that stuff, I think, is smouldering under the bottom of this panic, which really the main call is just to be specific, follow justice, and don't let this turn into more of a mess than it already is.
But just quickly on that, I think what's kind of really interesting about this whole, this has been going on for years now, this discussion, and to the point at which we can actually talk about it semi-honestly, is the fact that when all the time we weren't talking about the grooming gangs thing, the paedophile panic thing was right up there. It was constant news. If you think about now, Nick, the fantasist in the centre of the Operation Midland scandal, effectively, where he made all of these, as it turns out, completely made up accusations about MPs, abusing, murdering, dismembering young boys like himself. All of this was at its height when we weren't talking about a lot of these scandals, or at least they were so there was a strange thing where actually it just demonstrates how messed up the whole discussion of again kind of intergenerational stuff, all the kind of paedophile issue, is the fact that even when something quite clearly was going wrong in particular towns and cities across England, when there was obviously something going on in which parents weren't being listened to, victims weren't being listened to, they were being turned away. At the same time, it feels like the British political class could also run off on a witch hunt over things which were obviously just made up, and I think that just shows how, given we do have this panic, it just shows actually that even when some of these very real problems in the here and now are staring us in the face, some people don't seem to be able to deal with it.
A great illustration of that is the fact that, Tom Watson, who had long touted a conspiracy theory that there was a paedophile ring in Westminster and, had accused fellow MPs and peers of being paedophiles, he is now the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Whereas Sarah Champion, who started talking about this issue of Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs, was sacked from the front bench. You're rewarded for talking about crimes that didn't happen and are not true, essentially making things up, and you're punished for trying to get to the truth of these matters. You're listening to the Spiked podcast. Spiked has no paywalls and no subscriptions. It's contributions from listeners and readers like you that keep us fighting for freedom and democracy. If you'd like to support Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com and hit the donate button. Up next, Blasphemy. This week, voters in Ireland go to the polls in a referendum which could overturn its constitutional ban on blasphemy. Until recently, blasphemy laws were also on the books in Denmark. They had largely lain dormant until 2017, when a man was arrested for posting a video of himself burning the Quran. I caught up with free speech campaigner Jakob Mchangama, who succeeded in overturning Denmark's blasphemy laws. I started off by asking him when he first realised that free speech needed to be defended.
I grew up in one of the most liberal, tolerant societies in the world, Denmark, where no one ever thought about free speech because it was just as natural as breathing the air. And then, of course, we had the cartoon crisis, and that was the wake-up call for me, and that's very much what has shaped my both my interest and understanding of free speech, because it was such a dramatic event, but also because it dawned on me how vulnerable free speech really is.
And it was a cartoon of Muhammad.
It was a cartoon, yeah. I mean, I speak of this as, if everyone will know, it was the publication of 12 cartoons of Prophet Muhammad on the 30th of September 2005 in the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten, which in 2006 caused an international crisis with scores of people have died so far. Lots of the protagonists still living with with 24/7 security on Al-Qaeda death list, and so on. Suddenly you had, progressive who had been sort of the champions, supposedly, of free speech, who had been very skeptical of religious dogma, rejecting the idea that religious dogma should be above sort of free speech. And then suddenly you had them turn around and say, wait a minute, you can't offend religious feelings of a supposedly marginalized minority. And that, continued even after it became clear that people were willing to kill people for just, publishing a cartoon.
We don't have official blasphemy laws in Britain, and you've succeeded in overturning the laws in Denmark, am I right in saying?
Well, actually, we succeeded in getting them repealed last year. That was frightening as well, because it had basically been a dead letter. No one had been prosecuted since the early 1970s. No one had been convicted since the 40s. And it was assumed a dead letter by all. But then a guy burned the Quran. Shortly before that, sort of a group of independent legal experts had said, well, we shouldn't abolish the blasphemy ban because if someone burns holy books, it would be nice to be able to prosecute them. What they hadn't included in their report was the fact that a Danish artist had actually burned the Bible on national news, on the Danish equivalent of BBC. And lots of people had filed complaint to the police, and the chief prosecutor just said, we're not going to charge him because that's artistic freedom and so on.
Yeah.
And now suddenly they wanted to change things around because they were so afraid of a new cartoon crisis. But we were able, my organization, I like to be modest normally, but I think that I can say that we actually played a pivotal role, maybe the decisive role in getting the votes out among MPs to have the blasphemy ban abolished rather than revived. So that was nice. But yes, until very recently, we did have a blasphemy ban.
And of course, some of the thinking behind, why even a liberal country would want to have laws against blasphemy is that it would protect against terrorist outrages, that it would help a multicultural society almost cohere. But why is that thinking wrong, do you think?
Yeah, I think there are both naive and cynical reasons. So the cynical reasons are, let's not poke around this anymore because we don't want terrorists come to Denmark and blow things up. And then there's sort of the naive, but even perniciously naive idea that some people who have a particular skin color or a particular religion should be shielded against offense, whereas others shouldn't. I don't know where that leaves me. My father's a black African Muslim, and my mother's a white European Christian. So maybe I should tolerate if someone said something about Christianity, but should get absolutely outraged if someone said something about Islam, which of course is nonsensical. But I think it's, Denmark is a secular liberal democracy, among the most liberal secular in the world, but we weren't always so. In fact, if you go back to the Enlightenment, Denmark was very much sort of the horror story that people like Tom Paine and earlier Whigs like Robert Molesworth wrote about, sort of to warn about the dangers of absolutist rule and also about, what happens when you sort of mix religion and politics, because Lutheranism had become sort of the state church that suppressed everyone in Denmark. And that's in a historical point of view, that's a recent past. So it's, so I think we should really not take for granted that we're a secular liberal democracy with free speech. And those who want to become members of the Danish society should accept the admission of becoming full members of a liberal society is that, you don't get to have any vetoes, sort of heckler's vetoes or jihadist vetoes. You can have your ideas. Freedom of religion is protected, but freedom of religion does not give you the right to tell others to stop offending your beliefs.
On the subject of blasphemy, maybe even throughout Europe, there is a kind of unofficial cultural pressure that acts as a kind of informal blasphemy law. I mean, is that just as significant, do you think?
I think that it's very significant. I think if you read someone like George Orwell, he puts it very clear, and John Stuart Mill as well, that the prevailing orthodoxy among the elites about what you can and cannot say acts as at least a big barrier to free speech and very much so in democratic societies that don't formally prosecute all kinds of speech that very much plays in. But I would say when it comes to Islam, fear obviously also plays an important role. You cannot blame journalists and people working in the arts for being afraid and having to take into account security measures. But I think it's absolutely crucial that they're honest about it, that, and not say, oh, we did this out of respect or because, this or that. Just come out and say, listen, we would have liked to publish a cartoon of Muhammad or whatever, but we were afraid of doing it because that then shows where the red lines are. And I can respect that.
I mean, obviously, a lot of these religious conflicts are to do with Islam in today's world. Some very right-wing people might describe this as a kind of Islamist takeover, but that's not quite what's happened, is it really?
The current Danish centre-right government has introduced more restrictions on free speech than any other since the Second World War, and a lot of the people that I was campaigning with during the cartoon crisis, who said on the right, free speech is absolute, we can't give in. This is an Enlightenment principle, blah blah blah. They've just turned around and said, when it comes to Muslims who have extreme views, we can't be naive. The arguments that they use, are just the distorted mirror image of those that came from the sort of progressive left during the cartoon crisis. I think it's very depressing to see how unprincipled many people think on free speech.
Performers at the music festival Wireless have been banned from swearing, wearing offensive clothing and making vulgar gestures when it returns in 2019. It's part of Haringey Council's new licensing conditions. Surely hip-hop has always offended the uptight, but what do we make of this new plan?
It's crazy. It's really the kind of not in my backyard to the extreme. The fact is, Wireless Festival has been going on for quite a while. I grew up in Finsbury Park. There's been lots of music festivals in that area. People get really, really pissed. Quite a lot of young people show a lot of skin. There's some very popular acts that perform there. All in all, everyone has a good time, right? Apart from if you're a grouchy resident who has decided that this one weekend of the year is too much to bear, as well as banning not just people from attendees from wearing vulgar t-shirts, whatever that means. But they've also stipulated that performers should not be allowed to mention anything rude in their act or make rude gestures, which really could mean anything. And they've shut the festival down by half an hour. So it used to go until 10, now it's only 9:30. The key thing to say is this is happening right across London. There's a real clampdown on nightlife. And you don't have to be a kind of pill-popping, all-night sort of a party animal to realise that there's a bit of a problem going on in which the kind of one of the most famous cities in the world is stopping world-class acts from performing past bedtime. It's just quite nuts to me.
I mean, it's completely pathetic, isn't it, I suppose? And It's interesting you mentioned that this is happening throughout the rest of London. I mean, even Hackney Council, which has some of the best nightlife spots in London, has said they don't want to open any new bars, that are going to stay open past 12 o'clock. I mean, how on earth is London supposed to be a global 24-hour city if, we have these ridiculous restrictions on when we can go out until?
No, it is absolutely ridiculous because, again, it just kind of undermines the entire point of some of these areas, some of these venues. You think about Wireless Festival, I mean, it wasn't always this way, but for most of the time it's existed. It's an explicitly hip-hop, R&B festival, a lot of grime music, all that kind of thing. The idea that there's going to be a swearing ban, something like that, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. But as you've both been said, it's really knitted in with this kind of war on nightlife, the way in which that increasingly local councils will take the complaints of a handful of kind of not in my backyard type people, really, and clamp down on clubs, on venues, really tighten up licenses for even just pubs that want to open late, a little bit later, which is really difficult these days. And what's interesting about it is actually there's part of this which kind of knits in with some of the gentrification stuff. Like you hear some of the people who are actually who run clubs and venues talk about this. They say that they never get complaints from the council estates. Sometimes they do, and if anything, they're far more likely to take those seriously because a lot of people don't have choice sometimes in terms of where they're placed. But more often than not, it's the people who move in, the gentrifiers, people like me, effectively, who are causing all of the problems, effectively. And it's such a shame because, as you say, if you go to any other proper kind of, international city, you don't have this kind of ridiculous killjoy attitude because it's recognised even by a lot of the people who live there that this is one of the things that makes the city special.
Well, it's interesting how this isn't just about sort of classic antisocial behaviour, so like, beer cans being left around and people being rowdy in the street, but they've taken on the language of the perpetually offended. So the fact that it's about vulgar gestures and rude music and that kind of stuff that's you normally see happen in bans from students' unions, but is presumably being put forward by adults, and I'd wager adults of a certain age in this case, who are sort of taking on that overly sensitive, perpetually offended language. And I think that's definitely something new. It's not just about grouchy old people who don't want people puking in the streets. It's this sort of political use of the kind of culture of offence.
Well, I think that's right. It's worth noting that Haringey was one of the first councils to be taken over by Momentum. So
who like to pose as quite kind of youthy and fun-loving, don't they?
They love Stormzy, but until 9:30.
No.
Yeah.
And no swearing. You've been listening to the Spike podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a rating and a review. It really helps people find the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.